Here, this is Ken Hammond. He's professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University, holds a PhD in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University. He lived in Beijing from 82 to 87 and has taught and traveled in China many times over the ensuing years. From 2007 to 2017, he was co-director of the Confucius Institute at New Mexico State. He's written numerous books and articles on modern China, intellectuals and cultural history, and is most recently the author of China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future. The talk today will explore China's efforts to achieve the stated objective of building an ecological civilization as part of the global struggle with climate change and planetary warming. I actually became familiar with Ken through a mutual friend, Rick Sterling, who introduced me to Ken, and two previous speakers we had, Jay No and George Koo, who spoke about China a couple of years ago. So with that introduction, let's learn a little bit about China, which we all should learn about.
Yeah, okay. Well, obviously, whenever we start talking about China, you know, the challenge is to keep it under control because you know, we could spend hours and hours just going deeper and deeper into things. So what I'm going to try to do, and I think what about 50 minutes or so, is to work through some concepts and some background in terms of you know, modern history, just the last, you know, during the history of the People's Republic, and then talk a little bit about some of the developments that are taking place right now, literally right now, in China that relate to this topic, this rhetoric or this term of ecological civilization. In Chinese, that's 生态文明. Is a concept that's been getting a fair bit of hype, a fair bit of deployment by of course Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the President of the People's Republic, but you know, by many other people in the Communist Party, in the state administration, in academia in China. It's a concept that is hardly unique to China. But in its Chinese articulation, it has particular qualities and characteristics that I want to touch on a little bit, and of course a particular historical sort of emergence that I think also is worth taking note of. So this idea of ecological civilization, it's something that has roots, I suppose you could say. It has antecedents within traditional Chinese civilization, within traditional Chinese culture, and indeed within sort of various strands of the classical tradition. It's an idea that certainly resonates with the teachings of the philosopher Mencius. Mencius, follower of Confucius, in the third century, third and fourth centuries BCE, talked a lot about the way in which economic activities should be conducted so that they did not come into conflict with sort of natural patterns or natural principles. That there should be respect for the cycles of the season. There should be respect for the sort of intrinsic capacities of an environment to sustain and renew itself. There shouldn't be excessive, you know, harvesting of one thing or another, and a real sort of sense of the necessity of careful management in order to sustain and perpetuate the viability of society. And of course, this was articulated in a framework of political economy because Mencius, like Confucius before him, had essentially positioned himself as someone who wanted to be an advisor to rulers. So we always have to see it in that sort of context or framework as well. But these kinds of ideas were also classically articulated by thinkers within the tradition that we call Taoism, in particular the writings of a figure that we identify as Zhuangzi, whether or not that's actually a single historical individual. That's an arcane question that scholars get into. But the writings of that have come down to us under this name of Zhuangzi also relate a lot to the idea of living in a way that minimizes sort of environmental impact, living in a way that operates within the recognized and to some extent the unrecognized constraints of the natural world around us, not pushing the world, but working within the world, working with the world, working with the patterns of nature, the cycles of nature, things like that. These are classical texts that go back, well over 2,000 years, and have informed Chinese intellectual culture across that time, which doesn't mean, obviously, and we'll talk a little bit about this more in just a few minutes, doesn't mean that China, incarnated some ecological paradise or something like that, as we'll talk about. In fact, things were often quite the opposite. But there are ideas, there are concepts and precepts that can be drawn upon by those wishing to articulate some kind of environmentally sensitive or responsible kind of politics and economics today. Of course, for a figure like Xi Jinping, while drawing on the classical tradition is important, and he's talked about that, and other leaders and scholars and stuff in China talk about that a lot. But for Xi Jinping, as leader of the Communist Party, of course, he wants to articulate this in a framework that also, and indeed primarily, is rooted in modern socialist Marxist theory, things like that. And in that regard, we can see this concept of ecological civilization, of a kind of sustainable way of living, which nonetheless allows people to live at a comfortable, to say the least, level of material life, is one that for Xi Jinping and others in China today draws on some of Marx's writings. Whether it's in the early writings, the 1844 manuscripts, what are sometimes called the economic and philosophical manuscripts, or even in the notebooks of the Grundrisse, or in the volumes of Capital, this idea of what Marx sometimes calls a social metabolism, the idea that the way that people live, the labor that they perform, the work that they do, the products, the values that they create, ideally should take place in a way that is obviously sustainable, that is going to perpetuate the lives of those who are encompassed within this social metabolism. But more recently, a Marxist scholar, the editor of the Journal Monthly Review, John Bellamy Foster, has talked about this. He's drawn on a lot of Marx's writings about this, and elaborated a concept that he calls the metabolic rift, which is to say that under capitalism, the drive for the valorization of capital, the drive for endless, relentless accumulation, and the competitive struggles to innovate and create new demand and new market and all this leads to a rupture in the relationship between human society and the natural world, which manifests itself obviously in many ways around us every day, whether it's simple smokestack pollution from the dark satanic mills of mid-19th century England, or all the various things that have come down to us across the last couple of centuries as human capital interactions have polluted the environment, caused global warming, brought about a situation in which we have entered into a society of extreme environmental precarity that we're really not doing a very good job of coming to grips with yet. So we have both this sort of inheritance from the deep past of China, and this sort of more contemporary articulation of ideas drawing on Marx and his later elaborators to yield this concept of ecological civilization. And Xi Jinping has talked about this as something which should be, the primary objective to salvage the situation, for the Chinese people. But of course, this is something that can't be done on a one nation basis. This isn't something that could be done, within a particular set of confines. This is something that encompasses the planet and really requires that people around the world and their governments, their leaders, their economic as well as political leaders, kind of get with the program. So this is a concept that's been trotted out. It's been discussed at some length in Chinese media, both popular media, academic journals, programs, symposia, things like this, for a while now. Okay, but to put that into a little bit of a kind of practical context, I want to think about a little bit about what the ecological or environmental situation, what is the sort of more immediate context in which ideas like this and the situation of environmental crisis, how has this manifested itself in modern China? Just because we had thinkers like Mencius or Zhuangzi and others after them, talking about human nature balances and the harmony idea of yin and yang and various other cosmological ideas that get invoked in the tradition, certainly does not mean that the imperial state or the economies of China, as they've passed through various developmental phases historically, operated in ways which were entirely sustainable, to say the least. We know environmental historians of China have done a lot of very good scholarly work on the long processes by which deforestation and transformations of the environment through resource consumption and, of course, simple growth of population, the pressures on resources from an ever-growing population in China for a long time, have resulted in a long history of environmental stress and degradation, and that's something that is clearly documented and increasingly well understood. And by the middle of the 20th century, all of that reaches a kind of hyper crisis, if you will, complicated not only by things like population and normal economic sort of pressures, but of course by the complexities of the modern world, by the impact of Western imperialism on China, the invasion of Japan in the late 1930s, then the civil war between the communists and the nationalists in China, so that by 1949, when the People's Republic is established, China is in a deep and multifaceted crisis. It's in a crisis where there's been a lot of destruction, economic destruction, infrastructure being destroyed in these decades of warfare. You have many millions of people displaced, refugee populations flooding into cities, all kinds of stresses being placed upon food supply and things like that, communications infrastructure, many different things coming together. And at that point, you have the establishment of a new political system, a new political order. The long revolutionary struggle from the early 1920s till 1949 reaches not an ending, not a culmination, but a transition to a new point where it's not a matter of making the revolution to gain power, but using that power, using that revolutionary position now to try to bring about a different order, a different way of doing things. And that's the task upon which China embarks in the 1950s. And for the first 30 years that the People's Republic is around, from 1949 basically to 1979, they do a lot of stuff, some of which works and some of which doesn't. And there are deep divisions of opinion within the leadership of the party and in broader circles in Chinese society about how to go forward. There is a vision, a sort of ideological precept of socialism. And the goal, the stated goal, is the building of a new China, a socialist China, a China that would be more just, more equitable, a place where the working people would play a greater role in the administration of social affairs, things like that. But that is not something that they had a clear. There were several clear visions, but there was not a consensus. And so you get conflicts between different groupings. You get initiatives, some of which proved successful, some of which proved very unsuccessful. And we can talk about that more if we want to in the Q&A part, but I don't want to get bogged down in the details of all the history at this point. The point is that by 1978 or so, after a number of the important leaders of the early period of development had passed from the scene, including, of course, most importantly, Mao Zedong himself, China finds itself in a particular moment. During those first 30 years, China's economy had grown. It had been stabilized in the early 50s, and through a two-track sort of process of industrial, the conversion of urban industries and all to state and collective ownership. Industrial production had been ramped up, largely focused on what's sometimes called heavy industry. And the agricultural sector had also developed significantly. There'd been a long process, an incremental process of agricultural cooperativization and then collectivization in the 50s. That gets into a bit of a bind with the Great Leap Forward. Again, we can talk about that if we want to, but that's a step along this process. But there's political turmoil going on. There's conflict between different leadership groups, different approaches to development. Nonetheless, they advanced their economy by about roughly 3% a year on the average during these 30 years. So that by 1978, 1979, China has accomplished significant things. It has improved life expectancy, lowered infant mortality, enhanced the supply of housing for people, provided educational opportunities, invested in infrastructure. There's a lot of gains that had been made, but China at that point is an egalitarianism of poverty, right? It's a society in which the gap between those who had less and those who had more was not very wide. Right? There was a gap, and there's a gap between urban and rural, and there were other hierarchies of a type, but they weren't, they weren't massive. Economic measurements like the Gini coefficient were pretty low compared to other societies, especially in the West. But even so, that level was pretty minimal. People weren't starving to death. People weren't living homeless on the streets. People had food to eat and places to stay, and there were opportunities for at least many children to be educated. Only about 10% of young people could go to college, but a lot of people got basic education. There were a variety of ways in which things had improved, but in part simply because of population growth, a lot of the progress that had been made had just been literally eaten up, right? So at that point, the leadership that finds itself in control at that point decides to embark on a different course. And this is the course that China remains on today in many ways, what's called reform and opening to the outside. And this involves the idea that as they like to put it, the idea of using the mechanisms of the market to develop the productive economy. The idea being that historically, Marx and Engels talk about this, Lenin understood this back in the new economic policies. Markets can drive economic development. Markets can drive the advances of productivity. They historically have done this. But They can't be left to themselves. Left to themselves, markets may produce economic growth, but it's a growth which is very maldistributed. It's a growth which is embedded in structural inequalities based upon the division between those who own the means of production and those who actually do the work to produce, right? In a capitalist economy, that was the historical experience of tremendous economic development, but in a way that resulted in these classically unequal societies. China, as a aspiring socialist state, wanted to go about this in a different way, and they of course had the infrastructure of the socialist government, and they had the Communist Party. And so when they embark upon this endeavor, this experiment really, of using mechanisms to develop the productive economy, the key to it for them was that this would be done with the guidance and oversight of the Communist Party in an effort to constrain and contain, the more negative, the more deleterious impacts of the market, while recognizing that there were going to be, contradictions that were going to emerge along the way. And I think this is really critical to understand, that there was an awareness, not perhaps as fully developed and finely tuned as might be hoped for, but given the realities, the material realities they were working with, I think they had a reasonable idea that problems were going to emerge, that this wasn't going to be some, seamless, happy ride down the market path, but that there would be corruption, as what had been state enterprises, collective ownership, as certain social assets were privatized, and as private assets were tolerated and allowed to develop. This was going to create situations in which people in positions of authority in the party and the government might abuse those positions to enrich themselves, enhance their own positions. And corruption indeed emerges fairly quickly and becomes a serious problem. Inequality, right? They had achieved an egalitarianism of poverty, but now with the expansion of the economy, as Deng Xiaoping, the leader of all this in many ways, put it, some people are going to get rich first. And if that process of some people getting rich first was simply a matter of some people working harder, having better ideas, being more creative and innovative, a lot of people would go along with that. But if it was, again, a result of taking advantage of situations, of abusing positions of power or authority, that was going to be a little more frustrating, right? But they also understood on a certain level, looking at the historical experience of rapidly developing modern industrial economies in the rest of the world, that there would be environmental pressures, environmental stresses, indeed environmental damage and degradation. And anyone who paid any attention during these years, especially those of us who spent time in China during these years, saw this happen very, very quickly. That by the end of the 1980s and certainly through the period of the 1990s, the early 2000s, a lot of things went pretty bleak in terms of the environment. There was air pollution. We've all seen the pictures of Beijing locked under these layers of smog. There was water pollution. We've heard the stories of polluted rivers, die-offs of fish, people not being able to drink the water coming out of their taps, things like that. Soil pollution that resulted in tainted crops, all kinds of problems. Those things actually, they took place, and it's, ridiculous to try to ignore that. The calculation was that in order to grow the economy to a point where the material quality of people's lives could be improved, that these costs were going to be part of doing that, but that at a point it would become possible, there would be enough social accumulation of wealth, if you will, that they could start to tackle those problems in a way that the markets by themselves couldn't. That market economies by themselves, as we can tell from where we live, simply can't. That the political will, the institutional commitment and ability to do that is sorely lacking in political and economic situations in which profitability and capital valorization are the number one values. Okay. Of course, one thing I didn't mention that is right at the core of all this and can't be left out of the equation were the one-child policies, right? Population growth in those first 30 years had meant that even though the economy grew at 3% a year, population grew almost that much, not quite. There is an improvement in standard of living, material availability, but a lot of the growth, a lot of the expansion was just trying to stay ahead of the population curve. Once the one-child policies are put in place, it's possible for economic growth to result in steadily rising levels, material standards of living for people, because the rate of population increase was dramatically, curtailed. Now, eventually, those policies and the what the demographers call the demographic transition to a lower birth rate, became just part of social reality. And now, of course, the birth rate is such that the population is actually plateaued and starting to inch down a little bit, which of course leads to various debates and conundrums right now, and we'll touch on that in just a little bit. But the period of the 80s, the 90s, even the first decade of the 21st century, this was a period where China wanted to grow its economy. It knew it was going to use these market mechanisms to do that, and it knew that it needed access to global capital, to technology, to information from the global capitalist system, right? And so it went in pursuit of that. It opened itself up. It allowed foreign capital to come in. It created these special economic zones, but eventually, allowed a lot of capital to come in all over the country. A lot of joint ventures were operated. A lot of profits were repatriated to foreign corporations. And, that led to a period of tremendous expansion. Over 20 years of double-digit growth, 10, 11, 12, some years even 13% growth in GDP on an annual basis. That was pretty remarkable, especially, of course, as time goes by, those growth rates, it's one thing to grow an economy 10% at when it's a relatively small size. But after 10 years of that, you've got a much bigger economy. And if it's still growing at 10 or 11%, that's a lot more growth. And by the time you've done it for 20 years, well, it's a whole different ballgame, right? So during that time, China had to accommodate itself, if you will, to the global capitalist system. And for many people, and I understand this, a lot of people that I've known for many years and are very sincere, progressive, socialists, whatever people like to call themselves, it was easy to look at China and say, oh, yeah, well, they've kind of just sold out and taken the capitalist road. Look at them, here they are. They even let capitalists be members of the Communist Party. What the heck's going on with that? And the reality is that the leadership in China, as inspired by Deng Xiaoping, once again he pops in to have a few pithy words, and his advice in the 90s, when reform was getting really into higher gear, was that what China needed to do for a while was to bide its time and build its capabilities, meaning, accommodate the capitalist system, work with global capital, get the things that we need to develop our economy from the global capitalist system. And don't push the idea that we're socialists, we're communists, whatever. Don't push that in people's faces, right? Bide your time, keep a low profile. And when we reach a point where we have achieved a sufficient level of development, and where we have achieved a level of social accumulation, which allows us to begin to address some of these contradictions that have been evolving, then we'll be prepared to do so, right? And of course, in some ways, what that does is that encouraged, that fed the wishful thinking, the fantasies in the West, that China was going to go through some kind of regime change, some color revolution, whatever, and become a happy subordinate component of the global capitalist system. But there began to be some counterindications. For one thing, in the late 90s, when the Asian financial crisis struck in 97, China managed to weather that storm by deploying financial assets that it had accumulated in the process of growth in ways that protected. It didn't just protect the mainland economy; it protected Hong Kong. Money market speculators were trying to drive a run on the Hong Kong dollar, and the Bank of China pumped a lot of money into Hong Kong to keep the Hong Kong dollar stable, and that worked. And I think that that was a sort of initial signal that maybe things were going to work a little differently over there. But of course, the biggie was 2008, when the collapse of the sort of speculative bubble, first in the United States and then spreading through the rest of Western capitalism, meant that consumer demand in the West kind of evaporated, at least for a while. More than 20 million people in China lost their jobs. They were working in factories that were primarily cranking out goods to go into the export market. And when the demand for those goods dried up, those people lost their jobs. But at that point, something interesting happened, which was that they didn't, get sent out the factory door with good luck, fend for yourselves. They had what's called a household registration, or a hukou, which meant that many of them had come into the southern cities from villages around the provinces. They could go home, where they were entitled to housing, they were entitled to health care, their kids could have schools to go to. They weren't living, the life of Riley. These were not out in the villages. The level of social provision is pretty basic, but it exists, right? And people were taken care of by the socialist core of the Chinese economy. And the state and the party directed a process of reorientation in the economy, not to disengage from the export economy, but to try to expand provision for domestic consumption, okay? Which meant that within a year, most of those 20 million or so people were back into gainful employment, either back in the factories from which they had been laid off, or in other job opportunities that became available. So nobody wound up sleeping in an old refrigerator box in a park, or just sleeping on heater grates in a sidewalk, right? You didn't have 20 million homeless people fending for themselves across China. You had a situation in which a system of social provision, the household registration system, could provide basic level, care and support, sustenance, for a population of workers, so that they could get through a tough transitional time. That seems to have been perceived by at least some in the West, particularly in America. And I don't think it's a surprise that it's only 3 years later that President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton in 2011 rather, enunciate what is called by Obama the pivot to Asia, and by Clinton the call for a new American Pacific century. This is a reorientation. I think it's the final shedding of the fantasy that China was going to go belly up and become a part of global capitalism, and a recognition that different things were happening there. And of course, just a couple of years after that, really the next year, 2012, but taking office in 2013, we have the election of Xi Jinping and the beginning of what the Chinese have come to refer to as a new era, or the new era, right? All of which, that's all a long recap of People's Republic history and development. But it sets the stage for the things that are happening now, which, as I mentioned, involves Xi Jinping talking about this concept of ecological civilization. but also some other ideas that are emerging right now, and I'll get to in just a minute. Of course, Xi Jinping is in office for a while, 6, 7 years before we get the most severe test of China's system of social provision, which was the pandemic, right? Pandemic breaks out basically 2020, persists for a few years. As we know here in America, the pandemic was a profit opportunity for pharmaceutical companies and hospital corporations and insurance companies and all that. Super profits, being reported gleefully for stockholders and all that. While a million, 1.1 million people died, right? In China, the party, the state, social activists prioritized the preservation of human life, knowing again that their economy was going to take a serious hit, but saying, well, what's our priority here? And the priority was the preservation of human life. So that in the first 2 years plus of the pandemic, China had fewer than 6,000 deaths. And even in the, 15 months or so since the ending of the so-called zero COVID policies, there's been a bump, there's been an increase in mortality. It's still dramatically under that of the West. I think it's in the range of 60,000 people now. It's a lot of people given their earlier record, but that seems to have been the course that was decided upon. The handling of the pandemic was another indication that things were going to be done differently in China. And basically, both the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic were instances in which what we can call social accumulation, the accumulation of wealth resources in the hands of the state through tariffs and taxes and the operation of state enterprises, various other kinds of ways in which revenues have flowed into the state coffers. Those could be redeployed to address social needs. There was a huge, a lot of publicity around the point in just a couple of years ago where China eliminated absolute poverty. And what that meant was that they had ferreted out the last pockets where people were making less than about $1.50 a day. That doesn't mean that there are no more poor people in China by any means, but it does mean that they've lifted, throughout these decades of the People's Republic, hundreds of millions of people out of really bad economic circumstances into somewhat better economic circumstances. Now, some people, China's got a lot of billionaires. There's no question that inequality has grown. The difference between the people at the lower levels of the system and the higher levels, much greater than it used to be. But the situation at the lower levels is also much better than it used to be. Housing, healthcare, education, all these indicators have risen just as dramatically as GDP and whatever macroeconomic indicators you want to trot out. So we have a situation now where the party and the state have accumulated a sufficient level of social resources, social assets, that they're able to start addressing these contradictions which have emerged in the course of reform and development. Some of which, corruption, right away, as soon as Xi Jinping was in power, he launched new anti-corruption campaigns. Those get criticized in various ways. Oh, he's just going after his political foes. Well, Sucker must have a whole lot of political foes because they have really been pretty thorough in ferreting out people, abusing their positions of power and authority to enhance their own circumstances. And that's an ongoing thing. It's reduced corruption, it's reduced the level of abuse, but it hasn't eliminated that. And that it's going to be an ongoing concern so long as these kinds of mechanisms are being deployed. They've tried to address various other contradictions that have come along. Inequality, again, trying to raise people up out of poverty at the bottom. I think there's a lot more they could be doing to rein in the higher levels of all that, but that's another set of issues. Um, and most critically, and what we really want to loop back to here tonight is these questions of the environment, these questions of the damage to the air, the water, the soil, not just in one place, but on a larger, on a planetary scale. And there's a lot of things that can be talked about. China has invested massively in research and development in all kinds of areas. They have become the largest producers and consumers of alternative energy. They've shifted the energy profile of their domestic economy so that it's almost half of alternative energies: hydro, wind, solar, some nuclear. Um, but they're still very, very dependent on coal. I'll touch on that once more in just a moment. But they have just done tremendous things to try to enhance, try to address these environmental concerns. They are the biggest producers of and the most economical producers of solar panels. We as Americans, of course, don't have good access to those because our government would rather impose tariffs on China than give Americans the chance to fight for global warming. But that's as may be. They're the biggest producers and users of electric vehicles. And of course, I know now we're going to put tariffs on that. We're going to put import embargoes on that technology because God forbid that Americans should drive Chinese-made electric vehicles. The short-sightedness of our political leaders is often rather stunning. But the reality is China has been able to devote significant resources to addressing environmental issues. Are they doing enough? Are they doing everything possible? I don't know. I mean, I think they're doing a lot, and I think that they're very serious about their commitments. But they still have serious challenges, and the worst one of all, of course, is their damn coal. China, for better or for worse, just the luck of geography and geology, China has enough coal, even at present rates of consumption, to last them another 500 years. That's ridiculous. We can't live 500 more years at the rate of coal consumption that China is engaged in right now. That's got to change. There has to be continuing pressure to bring that down. They have articulated that as the goal, but there are institutional contradictions within China. The Ministry of the Coal Industry is a very, very powerful lobby within the Chinese state, and we need to recognize that as well. The last thing I want to introduce, and I know we want to have some time to toss some things around, is something that's being talked about right now. It's just come up in the last couple of months, and right now in the context of what's called the two sessions, the meeting of the National People's Congress and the Chinese Political Consultative Conference. This is a time when there's a lot of new ideas or other ideas getting kicked around. But there's a phrase that's coming to be popping up in the headlines a lot now, and I've been reading a lot about it, called new productive forces. Xi Jinping's been talking about this. Chen Bingkai at the Beijing Institute of Economics, a number of other people have been cranking out stuff about this. And what this seems to be all about is a moment in China's economic development where there is a drive to intensify the level of technological input in the productive processes. And of course, this is something which Marx talked about long ago in Capital, the idea that there's a distinction between constant and variable capital, or fixed capital and living capital, whatever you want to call it. The idea that as machinery becomes more important, machinery is accumulated labor, right? It's old labor that's been embodied in material form in machinery, right? And now with computers and technology and all this stuff, that process is accelerating, right? In a capitalist economy, of course, when technological innovation yields enhancements in productivity, those benefits are extracted by capital. Those benefits flow up to the owners of the means of production. In a socialist economy, those kinds of enhancements of productivity should result in a greater ability to implement social distribution in ways that mean that people don't have to work as much, right? And still they're going to be provided with the fruits of the labor that's being performed, the fruits of the production that is taking place on a more equitable basis, on a basis of socialist distribution. China's not at the stage of socialist distribution yet. We understand that. But they're trying to work in that direction, or at least that is the stated goal. And this idea of new productive forces, of driving to enhance new productive forces, to intensify technological inputs, to shift the proportionality in favor of fixed capital, of constant capital, so that less living labor is needed to continue to advance levels of productivity, so that, and this loops back to the question of the declining population, it's not a panic. We don't have to hit the panic button and say, oh my God, what are we going to do when there's fewer people working to support an aging population? You know what? You produce more stuff through better technology and through a more equitable distribution, right? And those two things work together. The goal of ecological civilization and this idea of new productive forces, they reinforce one another. Now, does that mean that China has achieved an ecological civilization? No, it doesn't. Does it mean that they're going to achieve an ecological civilization? I don't know. This is a work in progress. This is a project. This is a goal. This is a vision, right? I think the question for many of us is this something that we should support or something that we should oppose? They haven't achieved it, right? They don't have fully developed socialism. It's not a society of total equality where social distribution takes care of everybody at the same level. It's not. It's still a society that's being built. It's still a socialist future. They talk about being in the primary stage of socialism, but that could last for decades, right? There's a goal to move to a higher level of socialism by the middle of the century. Yeah, I mean, many of us probably won't be around to see whether that happens or not. But the question is this a project? Is this an endeavor that should be supported, or should we just, say, they're using markets, they're taking the capitalist road. Let's just, we support all socialisms except those that actually exist. I think that it's a challenge, not just for China, but for people trying to understand China and trying to come to grips with their own political challenges and engagements as well. So I guess that if I had to bring it down to a bottom line, and I'll do that, and then people can bring on the slings and arrows. I think it's worth a try. And I think that they're going to try. And I wish them luck. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ken. Let's transition into our discussion or our Q&A period. And if everyone could use their raise hand button, and we'll take people mostly in the order that the hands come up. And we keep your comments or questions to 2 minutes if you could. And we have plenty of time, and we can probably come back to you, but we'll try to hear everyone who wants to speak at least once, first of all. I see James. Go ahead and unmute.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for a nice overview. First, I just want to say hello from a friend, I think. Professor Dan Scotia was a guy that you must have known back.
Sure.
And he was a high school classmate of mine. So we're still in contact.
Oh, great.
What I wanted to ask about was if you could, one of the things, I've done very little research on China, but I've done some trying to understand, what's going on there. I was able to visit once. My adopted daughter's actually from China. Um, but I've kind of wondered about how the Chinese find consensus in the Communist Party. And you mentioned something about Chinese lobby within the state. And that was kind of like a term I never thought. When I think about lobbies, I think about how corporate lobbies work here. And so if you could just say a little bit about how their system to find consensus works, I'd appreciate that.
Sure. I mean, most Americans and don't really have any idea whatsoever of how the Chinese government is structured or how it functions or anything like that, let alone the Communist Party, and what the relationship between the party and the government is and all that. It's a system that is radically different from ours, and so. I mean, it's in many ways it's not surprising that I don't think a lot of Americans could very accurately describe the government of France either. But that's as may be. China is it is a political society, and it is a society that has a history of complex politics that goes back literally thousands of years, right? They invented bureaucracy. They invented, ways of political operating and maneuvering that worked for a long time. The imperial Chinese system, the imperial state, operated for well over 2,000 years. They must have been doing something right, So we have to understand that they have mechanisms, they have cultural traditions of consensus building, but also of compromise and making things work one way or another. In the present situation, the present context, one of the things when I referred to the the Ministry of the Coal Industry as a powerful lobby, that's not a mischaracterization, I think. There are I think something like 26 ministries. The number shifts across time, and I'm never entirely current with what it is at the moment. Some ministries get combined, some new ones get invented, but I think it's around that now. Different institutions at the ministerial level, and others that are more ad hoc, that have budgets, that have employees. The largest single institution in the world is the railway ministry in China, in terms of the assets it controls, the employees it has, and all that sort of stuff. So these are bureaucratic institutions, right? And if we think about Max Weber's writings on bureaucracy or other studies, bureaucratic institutions, while they may have, and most of them do, it's in one degree or another, they have an institutional mandate. They have something that they are supposed to be doing, and that they probably sincerely want to do. But in a government, in a complex political terrain, there are going to be different constituencies, different groupings, whose individual mandates, individual objectives may not be totally aligned with one another. So that in China, you have the Ministry of the Coal Industry. You also have the Ministry of Environmental Protection. Now, those ministries have institutional interests which can clearly come into conflict with one another. Ideally, theoretically, they shouldn't. Everybody should be in one big group hug. But the reality is that, the Ministry of the Coal Industry wants to be producing coal, and the Ministry of Environmental Protection wants to be reducing and minimizing the production and use of coal and other fossil fuels. Now, as it is, the Ministry of the Coal Industry is a huge institution with vast resources and assets. The Ministry of Environmental Protection is young. It's only been around maybe 20 years. It's not funded at anywhere nearly the same level. It doesn't have the same size staff. Its constituencies are more restricted. So there's a political calculus involved there. Building relationships, building alliances. The electric vehicle people are going to be aligned with the environmentalists because they want to go against the coal ministry, right? So it's a complex political terrain. So it's not so much, I mean, there's certainly lobbying by private capital as well, major capitalist figures, major enterprises, they're going to be in there, pushing their agendas. But within the socialist state structure itself, there are contending interests. It is not a monolithic, autocratic, top-down dictatorial system. That's just a foolish way to think of it. It doesn't help in terms of trying to work, anything with China, right? Even within the military, you can't even talk about the military as a single unit, right? There are different contending interests within there, So that's what I want to address when I think about this idea of sort of lobbying or something like that. Does that help?
It does. I mean, institutions, vying for their own kingdoms, and their own power and their own actually interests and goals and everything else. I mean, you see that here. So that's actually very helpful in conceptualizing how the power structure works. Thanks.
Sure.
All right, next up, Vicente, go ahead.
Thank you. And thanks, that was a good presentation. I wanted to ask, you mentioned about how China's economy is producing, goods that go out to the West and other, but mostly for export. Do you know if there's a sense over there of how, like, they're really also producing a lot of useless goods that consumers buy? Do you know if they have a sense of that this is actually, when they talk about how bad capitalism is, the stuff they're making, like, this is kind of what we're all rant about. Do they have that sense over there?
Some people do. Again, it is a complex terrain. So yeah, there are a lot of people largely in academic positions, but those academic positions, are integrated with and overlap with the state and the party, so it's not as though these are totally separate spheres. Yeah, there are people who are very critical of consumerism, as we call it, who are very critical of the ways in which market mechanisms drive the proliferation of demand, right? And that's part of that's part of the package, right? You can try to regulate that, you can try to control that and restrict that, but at the same time, there are pressures that are gonna push in that direction. There's also, I think, an element of pre-existing, or let's say externally arising, demand structures, right? If Walmart wants to buy some kind of junk, and China's social resources can be enhanced by producing that for Walmart, they're probably going to do it, at this point in time. Is that the ideal? Is that anybody's sense of the, well, it might be somebody's, but is that the sense of how that would best be for everybody? No. There are of course, there are some advocates in China, within the party even, who think that the markets should be given much freer rein. Those debates go on all the time about the degree to which the state should intervene, the degree to which the party should exercise oversight. There's not one answer to these kinds of questions. So yeah, China produces junk for the consumer market. What's the calculus behind that? Is everybody on board with that? No. As I say, there are people, there are significant critics of that as wasting resources, producing things that as you said, nobody needs this junk, but in the present context, this is stuff that's certainly still going on. Ironically enough, it may be that if the United States wants to so thoroughly decouple itself from China's economy, maybe the demand for some of that crap will evaporate. I'm not putting my money on that, but I think that that the questions of social utility of consumer products is a serious one. There are times, to be perfectly frank, there's times in China when if I'm in a shopping mall or on one of the big fancy streets in a city center, where I sometimes shake my head. I'm like, is this really what the revolution was for? There's a lot of junk around, but if it's part of a process of a long historical process, I think that that we have to see what the overall thrust of that is going to actually prove to be.
Right. Next up, Kim White. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Good. Thanks very much for your presentation. It's very informative and helpful. Four of us in this group not too long ago read a book by Radhika Desai called Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War.
Yep.
And she talks about the success of socialist countries in dealing with the pandemic. But she didn't really define what she meant by socialism. She mentioned China a number of times, but just referred to it as socialistic. So I think you provided a lot more details and a lot more information. I was in China once in 1998 in the Guizhou province, and I can attest to all the coal. There was coal soot over all the buildings and the plants, when you would walk around outside. Anyway, I was wondering about a number of things. Do you have any thoughts about the APEC meetings that took place in San Francisco a number of months ago, where Biden was there, and the leader of China? And also, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about this social credit system, this so-called surveillance system that's been adopted in China. And wanted to mention one other thing. John Pilger made a film a number of years ago about the upcoming war with China, which he shows maps of the 400 military bases that the United States has installed, all around the periphery of China. So I know that may be a lot, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on any of those topics.
I may need to loop back to you to make sure that I get to
Okay.
those, because those are big big topics. Let me start with the last one, because that's freshest in my mind at the moment. The United States sees China as a disruptor to a world system, which certainly for the last 40 years, say, but really for the last 75 or 80 years since the end of World War II, has largely been dominated by the United States. I mean, during the Cold War, of course, the Soviet Union was there as an alternative in some ways, but and certainly as a difference. But in many ways, certainly in terms of the global capitalist order, the United States has been at the heart of that since it eclipsed Britain coming out of World War II. And that was that world order was constructed over the previous century and a half by the systematic subordination of most of the planet to a global industrial capitalist order centered on Western Europe and North America, with Japan getting tacked on later in the game. That was a system of colonialism and imperialism and the extraction of wealth from around the world and all that. And the U.S. rose on that tide and emerged finally as the dominant core of all that. And China now is in fact it's a challenge to that. China is returning to a role in global affairs much more consistent with the one it occupied for centuries down until the middle of the 19th century. but it's disrupting the established U.S. centered system in ways that American political elites apparently can only perceive as threatening, right? If China develops and becomes a center of production and becomes a responsible participant in global affairs and becomes a place that other countries, come to interact with and engage in economic projects with, and maybe even admire and want to emulate. That can only be seen by American elites as deleterious to their interests, the power, the privileges that they've enjoyed for a long, long time. And so there's this drive to, at best, contain and constrain China, and potentially to perhaps roll it back. I don't like to contemplate what that might entail. And so this idea of building 400 military bases encircling China, the pivot to Asia, the redeployment of military assets, the political efforts to demonize and isolate China, and all that kind of stuff. This has been American policy under Republicans, under Democrats. The only division is who can, take the more macho rhetorical stance. But there's a pretty consistent drive to derail this reconfiguration of global geopolitical reality, and I personally, I mean, I'm a historian, I'm a global historian. This is a fool's errand from my analytical perspective. These are deep structural changes that have to do with the ending of the monopoly on industrial technologies in the West. As long as that was maintained, we could keep everybody else subordinate. That went by the boards. And now, China's on the technological leading edge in many areas, and other countries as well. It's not just China, in many other countries as well. But China is certainly in a very prominent position. And meanwhile, we're facing the existential crisis of the environment that we've talked about. It's American policy is self-destructive. It's short-sighted. It's reckless. All that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think that building those bases, maintaining that kind of military posture, is both a waste of time, but also a really serious risk to not to be too inflammatory, but to humanity's future. As far as some of the domestic stuff, when Radhika talks about socialist states, I mean, I think she's fairly ecumenical in her view. I think that Cuba, Vietnam, a few other spots around the world are countries that I think can still, with a certain amount of reason, be viewed as socialist countries. Cuba, of course, if anything, represents in some ways this idea of an egalitarianism of poverty, but one which has also achieved tremendous things in terms of its ability to not only care for its own people, but to provide healthcare services for developing countries around the world, things like that. So there's a range of socialisms, if you will, that might be thought of. For China, I think that it's this core of the economy. It's this ability to direct socially accumulated wealth towards socially beneficial objectives, whether it's healthcare enhancement or poverty eradication or employment security or fundamental social provision, et cetera, some of the things that I touched on. The social credit system. We hear a lot in America about the surveillance state. We are at the same time, of course, constantly informed that the comprehensive accumulation of data about us is actually a good thing, because it allows businesses to tailor their services to our perhaps not even fully understood needs and desires. It's the rhetorical distinctions get to be a little subtle sometimes. My experience with friends in China and in times, and I should be clear that I haven't been to China since November of 2019, right before the pandemic broke out. That was the last time I was there. I hope to get back soon, maybe even later this year. But I haven't been there in nearly 5 years, God. So, I can't speak to the most current state of affairs other than through information that I get from friends Chinese and expatriate friends who live there. But my sense is that, we hear a lot about the surveillance state. We hear a lot about things which in another context might be presented as consumer conveniences. I'm not really happy or comfortable with some of that stuff. I don't like it here. I'm not sure that I would like it there. On the other hand, I've had the experience of being in stores and shops where people come in, pick up what they want or need and leave because the technologies that they have in their phones or whatever, they're not interacting with complex purchase and sale structures. It's all done through computers, and this again is part of this technological intensification. And are there contradictions in that? Well, I kind of feel that way myself, but again, let's see how this spins out. China is not a society where everybody lives in fear of being spied on. It's just not like that. People in China go about their lives. People in China criticize the government all the time. Everybody bitches about everything. That's human life. That's social existence. Is it a good idea to go down to Tiananmen Square during the National People's Congress and hold up a banner that says "Overthrow communism"? No, that's not a good idea. But in the broad scale of things, I think that the emphasis on social provision and meeting people's needs is thought of in different ways in a society which has a couple of thousand years and more of its own distinctive history. China is not us. We are not China. The Chinese people, in many ways, are like us. In many ways, they're not. And they got to be them. So I think that something like the social credit system. I don't know. Should we do more in America to encourage people to behave better? Do we read constantly about crises of public morality and civility? I don't know. Do we have too many people shooting each other? It seems that way a lot of the time. Do we have a lot of people living homeless on the streets? Yeah, maybe there's ways that those things could be addressed. China goes about a lot of things in its own way, and the social credit system is one of those. I don't hear a lot of people complaining about it. I don't hear a lot of people feeling that, they've been deprived of something because of it. Does it encourage people to act in more socially responsible ways? Maybe. That's certainly the theory. Does it result in not the greatest outcomes sometimes? Probably. It's not a perfect product of, I don't know, artificial intelligence or something. But I think that again, we need to put that kind of stuff into broader and more nuanced context. Take me back to your first question, because I'm afraid I lost track of it.
About the meeting, the international meeting that took place in
the
San
APEC meeting. Yeah. I mean, I have thoughts about it. I think that when when the United States decides to act responsibly towards China and to stop trying to foment friction and to contain and constrain it and stop trying to provoke it by providing military assistance, shall we call it, to Taiwan and trying to ramp up hostilities between one part of China and another. I think if the U.S. acted in ways that were consistent with both its legal commitments to things like the One China policy, and its stated positions of support for engagement and competition rather than rivalry or something. That'd be great. And an opportunity like Xi Jinping and Joe Biden meeting in California, some good rhetoric came out of that. Whether that has been matched by behavior on the American side, I think remains to be seen. Certainly, I wouldn't go too far down that path. In the same way, not to open up too many cans of worms, but in the same way that all of the hand wringing and crocodile tears about humanitarian concerns in Gaza, without even the slightest indication of possibly reducing the fire hose of funding for the IDF. It's one thing to talk the talk, and it's another thing to walk the walk. And the Biden administration and American elites in general don't seem to be able to do that, certainly with regard to China.
Thank you very much.
All right, I'm going to ask a question that came up in the chat here from Bill. It says, can you comment on the following, or comment on the problems created by allowing provincial governments to make key decisions on energy production, including the use of coal plants? In addition, doesn't the focus on and accumulation of productive capacity create the same problems we saw in the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe in terms of the environment?
Well, the question about allowing provincial level administrations to make development decisions or investment decisions is an interesting one. On the one hand, it suggests a certain unease with the American federal system, and on the other hand, I think that it may suggest that maybe China needs more authoritarian centralization rather than less. I'm not sure where to go with that. I mean, yes, provincial level administrations make decisions about the allocation of resources and assets that they have. Do I always agree with the decisions that they make? By no means. And again, this is part of that multifaceted terrain in China, that it's not just central government ministries, but the different provinces, the different municipalities within a province, different localities. For a place that's supposed to be a communist dictatorship, there's an awful lot of flexibility and competition within the system, and I think that's sometimes not taken into account. I absolutely want China to stop burning coal and to stop using oil. They gotta get off the fossil fuel thing. I absolutely, and I think that there's a tremendous commitment on the part of many institutional players in China to do just that. They haven't done that yet. They've made very significant progress, much more so than almost certainly any other major economy on earth. But they got a long way to go. And I think that every time a provincial government decides to open a new coal burning facility, I think that's a mistake. I live in New Mexico. We got a lot of coal here, especially up on the Navajo Nation, and we're constantly struggling with that. Here in New Mexico, we got a lot of gas and oil out on the eastern plains here in the state. Our legislature just finished a session in which our state budget, the biggest chunk of it comes from revenues from oil and gas leasing. So we have a very complicated political landscape here. Do I think that New Mexico's doing enough? By no means. Do I think that actually New Mexico's taken some steps in the right direction? I certainly do. But I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more in Gansu. I'd like to see more in Shanxi. I'd like to see more in Guizhou that was mentioned earlier. So, these are political tasks, and as people who I think are committed to let's put a big umbrella on it, progressive politics, and to environmental responsibility. Yeah, you know, we got to be sending the message. There's no question about it. But I also think that we need to recognize that China has done probably more than any other significant economy to try to address these issues, and we want to reinforce that as well.
All right, next I'd like to go, we'll just do a little gender stack here. I hope you don't mind, Steve, but I'd like to go to Susan next to hear from Susan.
Thank you, Steve, for being so patient. Ken, thank you for your talk. I have learned a lot about China in the 70s and 80s, and I have a pin someone brought back to me from China that said, "Women hold up half the sky." And I'm very interested in your perceptions of what's happening regarding the birth rate, women's role, etc., in China, because I understand that there are many women who don't want to go back to the home and the hearth. Having been educated, I realize that it's very complicated and also therefore interesting. Thank you.
Sure, for sure. That's a great, that is a great topic, a great area to get into because, yeah, I mean, you know, the slogan of "Women hold up half the sky," that I, you know, got into learning about China back in the 60s and 70s as well. And that was certainly a very inspirational message at the time. I think that situation of women in China today is of course, it's complicated. The first thing an academic says about anything. But I think for the vast majority of Chinese women, the situation is actually pretty good. Women have education, women have professional opportunities, women have positions of responsibility in many sets of circumstances. I think it's remarkable and in some ways kind of inexcusable that there are so few women in positions in the highest levels of leadership on the Central Committee, although there's a fair number on the Central Committee, but in the political bureau of the Communist Party, within the State Council, as ministers of at least of the more significant ministries, in provincial governorships. I think that, you know, the enhancement of the position of women and the participation of women, not just in the workforce, but in positions of leadership, has been widespread, and yet it doesn't seem to have gone up. It doesn't seem to have gone up to the highest levels. And I think that that's something, if there's one area that I think China needs to get their act together on, it would be that. So that's one response. As for the birth rate question, that's a very important one. And I think that it's not just young women who don't want to go back to you know, more traditional family models and certainly not back to traditional gender roles and motherhood roles and all that kind of stuff. Many young men don't want to assume those traditional roles either. I think that lots of young people in China are very intent upon their lives, their careers, not just in a you know, I want to, you know, get the best job and make the most money possible, but in terms of I want to do things that are fulfilling for me, you know. And that has resulted in a significant decline in natural population increase, and now we're at a point of modest, very, very modest, but nonetheless genuinely appearing natural population decline. People are not having you know, as many children as would be required for the population to keep growing. That is a good thing, right? You know, technological intensification and other forms of socialist redistribution can mean that it's all right for the population to decline. You know, fewer people consuming fewer resources has got to be a good thing. 1.4 billion people living in China is a tremendous pressure on the environment. And if that pressure can be eased, to me, that seems like a good thing. And if if the economic and social challenges involved in that, in terms of providing care for older people, of course, I'm 74 years old. I'm going to be retiring one of these days. I want to be secure in that phase of life. If that can be taken care of through socialist provision, I think that's great. And I think that's what the message should be. That's what China should be focusing on. There are huge debates in China about this. There's a lot of economists and other kinds of academics and people in politics who see this as a crisis. Oh my God, what are we going to do about this? Too few workers supporting too few, retired people. What are we going to do about this? And China is hardly unique in dealing with this. This is why Macron wants to raise the retirement age in France rather than challenge systems of distribution. So I think that the decision by young people, men and women, to not have children or not have them so soon, or whatever, is a reasonable one. It's a rational one, and I don't think it's one that people should be criticized for or pressured to change. And to the degree to which state actors in China or party advocates in China do that, I think they're wrong. I think that this should be allowed to develop in a way that's gonna perhaps to some extent force the socialist system to make the right kinds of adjustments and to pursue the right kinds of policies. I hope that that's responsive. Okay.
All right.
Steve, you've been waiting, I know.
Steve, you're back. Thanks for your patience, and we are at time, so Steve will be the last question, and then we'll turn it back over to you, Ken, to respond and just to do a wrap up. Go ahead, unmute Steve.
Okay. Yeah, when I knew you in Ohio, I had already sort of taken the Chinese stance in the Sino-Soviet dispute, and the group that I was working with there, we kind of went along with that. Over the course of the next 60 years, it becomes difficult to maintain one's balance with respect to what's going on in China, because so many things have changed. It's so many new things, and old things have been modified. And so I try to catch on to what happens and what becomes public, that I can analyze and fit into my ideology. So one of the things that has presented itself to me, and which I found missing in your talk, is the foreign policy and the international economy into which China is entering and is perhaps the leading force. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about the strategy that China has adopted since 1999, the SCO, and then BRICS, and then this recent conference in which they absorbed, I think, 5 or 6 new countries into the BRICS alliance, and could say something about how you see that as an expression of what's going on in China, and how you understand that as being key to the new international situation that China has now emerged in with a strengthened BRICS over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. I know that you guys are facing some time constraints, so I'm going to do 2 things here. One is kick the can down the road a bit, because I actually have a book that'll be coming out in October on Chinese foreign policy since 1949. Not just foreign policy, but international relations. And there, the other thing I'll say just very briefly, because I don't want to overstay my welcome, is that, China's path of international relations has been complex and sometimes baffling. There have been periods where decisions were made, which I think, in the context, were kind of really hard to understand or assimilate. Support for the coup in Chile in 1973, things like that, or at least for the Pinochet government going forward. The discontinuation of support for revolutionary struggles in certain parts of the world, things like that. That took place in particular contexts and for circumstances that are probably too complex to tease out in the couple of minutes that I want to take. But I think that these days, China's conduct is premised upon ideas that go back to the early 50s of not linking international relations to a political agenda, if you will. And China comes in for a lot of heat about this. I understand that they're accused of coddling dictators and stuff. And the way the Chinese talk about it is that they do not impose political conditions on development assistance and other kinds of cooperative arrangements that they see as part of a process of developing global infrastructure, economic trade infrastructure that is out from under the hegemonic domination of the United States and Western imperialism. Those are fancy concepts, and I'm sure that there's there's wiggle room, in there. But I think that things like BRICS, I mean, China doesn't run BRICS. China is one of the countries in BRICS. It's a big one. I think the recent expansion of BRICS is interesting. I'm not entirely comfortable with some of the parties that have been brought in. On the other hand, I see it as an effort to build an institutional infrastructure that is out from under the thumb of the United States and Western Europe. And so it's a really complicated navigation that China seems to be engaged in. That I don't always, see the logic or the immediate significance of some things. But I think that things like the Belt and Road Initiative, things like other kinds of, trying to create alternative mechanisms for settling international payments, things like that. I think those make a lot of sense, and I think that's again part of this effort to develop an international way of functioning and operating that allows countries to escape from American domination. So I think that it's a long history, and one, as I say, that I think has its ups and downs, and it's two steps forward, one step back sometimes. But I can't really do more with it than that right now. But if you can be a little patient, there'll be a further exposition of this forthcoming.